Hey everybody, we are Martin, Robert, and Francis, and this is Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Get ready, we're about to live in your head, rent-free.
Welcome back to Snakes and Otters. This is episode number 19. Glad to have you here with us. This is an episode that this is Francis, by the way, in the captain's chair.
And I'm Robert.
And I'm Martin.
This is an episode I have been really dying to do for a long time, guys.
It's going to be good stuff.
It's going to be fun. We're going back to World War I again, sort of, kind of. And I know, Robert, you're not a big fan when we do that. You say we've pummeled that expired equine enough.
It's getting pretty mushy, is all I'm thinking. I mean, it's fun stuff. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. But it's just, we keep running into, we got to talk about this. Yeah, we got to talk about this.
It's hard not to, because as we've talked about every time, you can't understand the 20th century without understanding World War I.
Amen.
And you can't understand World War I without pulling out some of these things, or people.
Yeah, in this case.
In this case, it's going to be people, same as we did with Franz Ferdinand. You can do this overall thing of the war, but you've got to talk about these individuals.
That's exactly right. And we're going to talk about the one that we probably should talk about more than any other, and that's Wilhelm, Kaiser Wilhelm II. And the premise of this here is going to be, was he a douchebag, as some of us might say, or was he unjustly vilified, as others would say? And
or was he both?
Was he both? Oh, yes, the great Catholic answer, that's for sure.
Yes.
Both and. I just recently read a book on this. I just finished it, actually, before we... I've been reading several books on him, actually, but the one that most importantly that I read recently is called The Innocence of Kaiser Wilhelm II in the First World War. It's a recent book from 2015 by Christina Croft. She actually did a series of YouTube videos promoting the book and some interviews on it. And
Smart marketing.
Yeah, very much so. And I was very fascinated by it. She's written a lot about Victoria, Albert, their son Edward, and all those time periods through here, from the Victorian period all the way through World War I. And she puts out forth a premise. It's not a biography, strictly speaking. It is an argument saying that Wilhelm was, in fact, given far more blame than he should have had. He was not, and more deeper than that, he was not what we believed him to be at all.
Yeah.
And that was a fascinating subject, because we look back 100 years previously, and we have been nursed on the milk of the idea that Kaiser Wilhelm was the most evil individual that ever was, other than Adolf Hitler, but we link the two together mentally. That's not fair in either case, because Hitler was his own issue, his own problem, and yes, I think that what happened previously led to his rise, but it's not. There's a lot more blame here, and we need to set the record straight on Wilhelm. I think history has done him a disservice.
Well, I got two things for you. One, I love these kind of history books or biographies.
Yeah.
These are the things that I'm always looking for.
It's a quasi-biography, I guess.
Take a contrarian stance and then prove it to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, again, this fits right in with Christopher Clark.
That's right.
What we talked about.
Who also wrote a book
to
on
blame.
Kaiser Wilhelm. He also, I started that, I haven't finished that, but his is one of the 3 books I've been reading on him. His is more a traditional biography on Wilhelm, and it goes a little bit deeper on that.
Grab that too,
you should. It's very worth looking at. And there's another one.
Clark stuff.
Yeah, he's very, very good. And there's another one that I've been reading. It's George, Nicholas, and Wilhelm, the 3 royal cousins in the road to World War I by Miranda Carter.
Yes, I was just looking at that on Amazon. I was looking at to see how much this book costs.
It's 2010. These are all recent. Clark's book was 2009, so these are very, very recent.
Just a note, for those of you who might be interested in this book, I noticed that it is on Kindle Unlimited, which means that if you have a Kindle Unlimited account, which is about $10 a month, you can read this book for free.
The Miranda
the
Carter.
Innocence. No, the Christina Croft.
Oh, the Christina Croft.
Christina Croft is. That's correct.
So you can get it for nothing.
Basically, for $10 a month, you get it and thousands of other books.
I mean,
cool.
Hundreds of thousands.
It's reasonably priced for just a standalone if you wanted an ebook version of it too.
Oh yeah, $5.50.
Exactly, that's how I got it, and it was fascinating. It really was. It was a quick read. It didn't take me long at all. It does not get into the weeds. We talked a little bit about that at the show prep. It's so easy to get in the weeds on a lot of this stuff, and we mill a little bit maybe because you can't talk about Wilhelm without going into his background a little.
So that's what I wanted to hit you on next.
Yes.
A bio sketch of Wilhelm's very important here.
Yes, you got to know him.
You got to know. You can't just absolve him without really working through.
That's correct.
Who he was.
Both good and bad, and we intellectually we know, of course, no one is all good or all bad. We're all a mixture of that. But the story we've been told only speaks of the bad, and it's not. And some of it is not true. Quite honestly, we'll get into that a little bit later. But some of it was Some of it was taking things that were true about him, and paying it forward in the worst possible light. Yeah. He was a cripple. He would use that word himself. His parents were Friedrich Wilhelm, the Crown Prince of Prussia at the time he was born. Germany did not exist, but he was the Crown Prince of Prussia. His father was Frederick, and his mother was Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, Vicky. And they were formative to him in many ways, both good and bad. Wilhelm was actually a breech birth when he was born, and the process of his birth, he was the eldest, damaged his left arm. It messed up the nerves in it bad. That arm never completely grew fully. He could use it. He had full use of it, but it was withered. And it was obvious. And if you see some of the pictures with him, they're always posed in such a way where this is not obvious.
Yeah, his left arm's almost always hidden in photographs or any kind of official portraiture.
And he learned to be very good at doing that, of course, because he was known to be the heir, at his birth. He was Victoria's favorite grandson, believe it or not. Now, he was her first. I understand that somewhat, but he was very, very, very attached to her. Victoria doted on him more than any other. Vicky, Victoria's daughter, Kaiser Wilhelm's mother, was kind of her favorite anyway. Mm-hmm. She was brilliantly intellectual. She was one of the most brilliant women of the time, and she was also very outspoken, like her mother.
Yes.
And Frederick, Wilhelm's father, was of the same stripe in many respects.
Yes.
And they were a perfect love match in many ways. But Wilhelm, from the very beginning, had to overcome this difficulty. He had to learn to ride a horse on his own over and over. He fell countless times because he really couldn't. But he taught himself to, based on, I'm not going to be this cripple. Mm-hmm. I think that had a lot to do with his later bombast. Because he's very, he comes across very dramatic in many ways. This is all, my reading of Christina Croft and these other books really leads me to be, he was a loved child who didn't think he was loved in many respects.
Yeah, and he overcompensated.
Very much so.
Over the arm. He turned the rings on his right hand in and try to crush everybody's that he shook hands with.
Yeah, his right hand was actually stronger than normal because of his compensation, and it's pretty well documented on that. He loved to poke fun at people, a little bit mercilessly at times.
Yes, he could.
He loved drama. Some of this is just his position as Kaiser. Nobody tells them no. On certain things.
Who tells the emperor he is wearing no clothes?
That's right.
Right, and they grow into bullies, and he became a bully. He was a bully.
And really, that's the essential thing that we've kind of skirted around, but that's a great way to put it, because we've talked about all of these monarchies and what have you, and how autocracies are where we keep running into problems. Autocracies, by their very nature, are bullies.
Yes.
That's right. And Wilhelm had that in him because of his birth and his upbringing already. He was, and we'll talk a little bit about in another episode about his father and his mother, and how Wilhelm came to the throne much earlier than he should have. He was 27 when that happens.
Well, and there are some other influences in his life besides his mother and father.
That is correct.
He idolized his grandfather,
Correct.
Wilhelm I. Absolutely, he was a warrior king and absolutely idolized him. Bismarck is also a massive influence, not necessarily a positive one.
That is
not
correct.
A mentor,
He tried to be. He wanted to be, because he knew the way the wind was blowing. Bismarck did. He got to be one of the most canniest politicians ever.
In the end, Bismarck's for himself.
That's correct. and that is exactly right. That's very well phrased, sir.
So he's a typical politician.
Yes, he's a
Very much
politician.
so.
He's in it for himself. If cozying to Wilhelm II helps him, great. If trying to divide Wilhelm from his parents helps him, that's great too.
That's right.
So he did both.
That is exactly
Bismarck
right.
did both.
And to Wilhelm's credit, though, this did not last long. He was his mother was totally upset with him because he idolized his grandfather because his grandfather was ideologically galaxies apart from his father.
Yes.
And that was part of the problem. By embracing his grandfather, he is undermining his father ultimately. And
Okay, hold on. Before you go any farther with that, speak a little bit more about that. Give us the particulars, because I have the sense that that's going to be extremely important. And while all of this background stuff is interesting, most of it I think is not entirely germane to where I think you want to go with this.
Right.
So if I'm wrong, tell me, but I think this is going to be important.
Wilhelm was very much a lover of all things German, although he was a closet Anglophile. Very much so because of his grandmother. He was very British in many ways. He loved that. He was even made an honorary admiral of the British Navy as a boy. He was given the uniform. Wilhelm loved uniforms. He was very much
doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, but he had
that's
hundreds.
a very common practice amongst all of these monarchies. Is you're the honorary colonel of a regiment in the British Army, and then George V was an honorary colonel of a German regiment, almost certainly, and all
That's
that
correct.
kind of stuff. Yeah.
All those sort of things. So there's a militaristic environment here that loves autocracy. We've talked about this a little bit. Wilhelm embraced that because his grandfather was definitely the autocrat. And you have to understand the crucible, in which we talked about this a little bit with Elizabeth. What is the crucible that forms him in his backstory? It is the formation of Germany.
Yes.
That because he was a boy when this happens, and you cannot underestimate the fact that all of a sudden I was simply the heir for the Prussian throne. Now I'm an emperor in waiting.
You know, this is a really interesting point, because the father of your country happens to be your grandfather.
That's right.
So, whom you know, obviously, as you said, he lived during this. This is going to be an incredibly impossible standard to live up to.
That's right.
It was.
So this is going to play majorly into
That's right.
what goes
and
on.
it all came about as a result of an enormous military victory against the French with the Franco-Prussian War.
Right.
That's so you not only have this figure you idolize that is this pure autocrat, but he is absolutely covered in glory against your hated enemy.
Through the military conquest, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
That's correct.
I mean, it's not just...
And yet they were enlightened. It's very Hobbesian in many ways.
Yeah.
Because they didn't take over France. They weren't after that. We're going to defeat you, take what we want, and live our lives as we wish to, because we are good. We are German. This is how we live. Watch us.
It's probably because, again, that all falls around Alsace-Lorraine.
That is correct. Absolutely.
Nobody knows which country they really want to live in. This is the whole problem with these people.
That's very much
but
so.
That's very much part of the other part of the German problem, which I think is inherent with everybody alive during this time remembers when the country was unified, is Lebensraum. Living room, living space. That's that's going to be part of this.
It is part of that. It's not as big as it would eventually become, because
this is going to keep growing over time.
That's right. And ultimately, the strategic look at it is exactly right. At this point, though, they're so concerned with building themselves as a major power. See, they're the infant here against all these others on the stage, and they're better in many ways than some of their rivals. The British take, and I think this is key, the British take very dim view of them very quickly because they're actually beating them. Britain considers themselves the greatest power on earth. Nobody can dare rival us. And Germany comes very close. Their industry is better. Their innovation is better. Their economy is better. They're actually far more forward thinking. And this is under Wilhelm for taking care of the people. And that brings them enormous dividends. Britain is still very aristocratic in their thinking here. It's not about that. Victoria changes that some, but
that's because revolution, which is essentially what happens when you create a country. Mm-hmm. It's a revolution or rebellion. In this case, it's a revolution because it united these factions. But doing that, you spark something, and when that happens, you have something that just has never happened before. Whereas England has been around at this point for not quite 1,000 years in the form we would call it today, but really even longer than that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they're pretty well set in their ways, so to speak. So, yeah, of course they're going to be jealous.
Yeah.
That's why the British, even up until the time of the Civil War, one of the prior episodes we talked about, was conflicted about what to do about us. You know, we spoke the same language. We are literally their cousins. And yet, because we were a vibrant
Economic
nation,
competitor.
Oh, the British thought the same thing about us, too. They
Right.
wanted no rivals.
Well, yes.
You
Because
know,
when you're the top dog, rivals are not allowed.
that's exactly, and that is ultimately where a lot of the vilification, I think, of Kaiser Wilhelm goes. And Wilson was part of it in many ways, but only
Wilson,
once
Lloyd George,
and
yeah.
Clemenceau.
Yeah.
The British had a full-on propaganda department in World War One. That sounds bad, like we were talking about in the show prep. Propaganda sounds like a bad word, but it was not quite that at the time. But they had 100% control of the press at this point. And the message that they put out, they built the image of Kaiser Wilhelm that still persists to this day of being this power-hungry madman who is out to kill your babies and take everything from you.
The Hun's coming.
The Hun is coming. That's exactly where this comes from. And that's not quite fair.
Yeah.
There was plenty of atrocities in the war on all sides. Belgium was actually not quite as bloody as all the stories would make, because anything that showed the Huns in the wrong light was reported, and anything that the British did bad never got.
Right. And realistically, that's nothing new. That was going on.
That is correct.
Before Caesar.
But it was but it has been taken to a level of efficiency here that is absolutely scary. And that's kind of what my whole premise on this is.
That's just mildly disturbing. Today
that is
correct.
absolutely
Well,
and that's kind of the whole reason for this discussion
Right,
is to realize the power of information. He who controls information controls the world. Justice falls by the wayside very quickly, and Wilhelm is just an easy example of that.
As I said earlier, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that it's always easier to focus people on a single evil entity.
Right.
And that's what they did.
You have to personify it.
And exactly, they made Wilhelm personified in order to keep the war effort going. And then we make that jump. Well, you see exactly where Orwell got it.
Yeah.
The 2 Minutes Hate and Emmanuel Goldstein, you focus people's hate on something.
Let's face it. Humanity, for all whatever inherent goodness we might be prone to, we're also prone to a fair amount of darkness.
That's right.
If we let it happen.
Yes.
And love and hate, they're not entirely opposite, because people will tell you, the opposite of love is just total, I don't care whatever happens to you, Apathy. But it is much easier to focus that negative, because, let's face it, we're all concerned about our own problems. Mm-hmm. And when we are, it is so much easier to say, well, that's somebody else's fault, because it can't be our fault. We're good people. And if that's the case, when you start writing that nationally, that's when you get... And what's really scary is, as we're talking about the same thing, depending on which side of what political aisle you're on, you can say this about both sides of our national arguments today.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And I think
it's so easy to focus the hate.
We learned it here. I think we learned it here. I
Well-
think generationally, it's been with us forever, as you said, but it was refined to a powerful point here. And I think, as we said earlier, the reason that Joseph Goebbels, Hitler saw the whole propaganda necessity thing, he saw it as a necessity, was because they got smacked by it the generation before.
Well, he probably also realized there's no way in hell I can do this without
What's correct?
pre-selling it
And that's
setting the stage.
That's kind of my whole premise for this. The evil of propaganda teaches us as a species to do terrible, inconceivable, horrible things and like it. That's what we did here.
Yeah.
That's what happened here. Is and that's one of the reasons the war went on for so long, is because once you're in it, nobody is willing to say, I want peace.
You can't make peace with the devil.
That's right.
Oh, yes. That's excellent. Excellent
This
point.
war should
Yeah,
this war is probably the greatest
We can't
atrocity.
back down now. We're fighting evil incarnate.
Well, I mean, that we're discussing at the moment. There's plenty, but
Yeah, I was going to say that. Come on.
it's an easy one to see. It's an easy one to recognize.
But at the same time, I'm going to give you an instance in Wilhelm's life that made him easy to turn into the devil.
Oh, yeah. Oh, he did himself no favors at many times.
Yes, he was pompous to the point of being ridiculous. And to me, the central event in his life that is instructive about him, and it is, to a degree, it is blown out of proportion.
Yeah.
But his mother was the one doing the blowing out of proportion.
Oh, yeah.
But his father only lived to be in his 50s, Frederick III. He had esophageal cancer. When Frederick took over the throne, he was already dying.
Right.
He only lived for 90 days.
Oh, wow.
Or 99 days.
99
something
days, yeah, that's what
99
they
days.
call
He
it.
was only on the throne 99 days. That's why he's completely forgotten, basically, to history.
For some reason I was thinking he was longer. Okay.
Yeah, the story is Wilhelm hovered over his father, not out of concern, but when am I going to be Kaiser?
That's right.
His
His mother picks all this up and writes to her mother, Victoria, who's still living. And those are all the records we got.
Yeah.
You know, something
Christina
you
Croft
said-
talks about this. She says very clearly that we're getting a very, very biased, emotionally stilted portrayal of what really happened here. It was, and she does a good job in laying it out, saying that we are kind of peeking into Vicky's head on all this, and that forms our narrative. It's not quite true.
All right, so
Well, but we don't know it's not true.
yeah, we don't. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So let's circle back here for a second to your original premise: douchebag or unjustly vilified. Because I want to take that and build on something you just talked about. Pompous to the point of being ridiculous. Right. Now we've talked in our World War I podcasts about the major powers, although Austria-Hungary at this time, not quite major in the sense of Russia, Germany, and England. But these are the four monarchies that really are tied up in all of this. And three of the four don't survive.
Yeah.
Right.
And I put it to you. The three that don't survive are the most pompous to the point of being ridiculous.
Yes.
I think there's something there.
Yeah.
Because you can make an
You may have it
argument.
surrounded, sir.
Yeah. I think that douchiness that we've
a good word.
been talking about, that is tied into all of this.
Yeah.
Now, the English monarchy, it's already had its. Am I going to be a douchebag and be an autocrat, or am I going to, back off and we're going to work with the people? Because they've gone through that. They did that with John and the Magna Carta. They did that later with Charles II, and he lost his head over it.
Right.
And so their monarchy, maybe because they were on an island, I don't know, but their monarchy managed to evolve to the point where it was not. It was just didn't have the opportunity to be the
still
douche-
adaptable.
Yeah, well, yeah, it didn't have the opportunity to be the douchiness that these other three did because they didn't have the power anymore that those guys did.
Exactly. Yeah.
Autocracy breeds insulation, and that it reaches a tipping point during World War I and all these other places that they are. We talked about this earlier. They're so insulated and separated from their people and what's really going on that they push themselves into irrelevancy very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So-
Nicholas was a bathtub toy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's very well put, sir.
So-
Like that.
I think we've hit all of these biographical sketch things. Again, my position is he could be a huge douche, but I think you're onto something as far as exonerating him to a degree with war blame. And I know that's where you want to go.
I do.
And,
I think
again, I've already staked out a position that the Germans aren't to blame that much for the war at all. I mean,
we talked about that in many respects at the beginning. Kaiser Wilhelm was known before the war began as the apostle of peace. He's the one guy who's crying out, and maybe they're not listening, because ultimately they didn't, because he tries to convince the Austrians, don't mobilize. He tries to convince the British, don't mobilize, the Russians, etc. And Nicholas tells him, okay, fine, we won't, but they do it anyway, because he doesn't have any control. They want people, too many people wanted this. Mostly it's the Austrians at this point. If you go back and look a little bit about that, they were the powder keg. They were the ones that really wouldn't behave.
The ultimatum was not constructed with German input.
Correct.
It was all on their own.
Basically, the Austrian says, as long as Germany's got our back, we're going to go do what we want to.
We're going to push this all
and
the way
because
to
the
the wall.
alliance system, Wilhelm he couldn't. And this is a little bit of his own honor code building in. He couldn't break his word.
Yeah.
Well, and that goes back to something I was talking about during the show prep. We were talking about how would you have avoided World War One. The very first thing you got to do is do something that nobody was willing to do, which is get rid of all these damn treaties. Because that's the word.
The alliance system, exactly.
That's the word that he could not break.
That's right.
And that's part of the problem, is that all of these douchey people are locked into this
Circular firing squad?
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
It is. It's a circular firing squad. And that one little spark.
Yeah.
So all the alliance systems were a suicide pact.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it is. The Judean People's Front of Judea. No, Judean People's Front, crack suicide squad.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about.
Well, and when you think about it, because technology had advanced to the point where you now could wage war in a way that, on a massive scale, you could move tens of thousands of troops across hundreds of miles in a couple of days. That's a massive change.
Yeah.
It was no longer, this is the army I've got, and I'm going to take them, we're going to fight a battle, maybe a couple of battles. It truly is now a war. Mm-hmm. And really, when you think about it, this is probably, because even the Civil War, which is really what we would consider one of the first modern wars, was not the same kind of war. Civil War was a series of battles. World War I was the first war.
Nearly continuous
At least
battle. in one theater.
The military understood this, but the people and the leaders did not.
Well, I don't know that they understood it in the sense that
war
has changed.
They thought they did.
Yeah.
But,
I think they went to it with the same mindset. Well, this should be over quickly.
Yeah.
But things had changed, and that's what makes the alliance system a suicide pact, because once you begin, you have to finish. There is no get in for honor's sake, we skirmish, we fight a little bit, and we trade some territory. That's impossible now.
Yeah. And again, when you add in the propaganda part, now you've completely demonized someone.
Right.
Again, you can't make peace with the devil. He has to be destroyed.
Right.
That's ultimately the change here, because ultimately World War I, from the German perspective, was not about territory. It was about self-preservation.
Yeah.
And part of this is the way that the map lays out, is you've got Russia on one side, France on the other side, and Britain working as well, controlling the seas around you. They were pinched. That's why once war was inevitable, when even though Kaiser didn't want it, he said, well, we don't have a choice. We have to attack now.
Yeah,
and that's what
very
leads
formative on Wilhelm too.
Yes.
Is all this sense of constriction around,
and there's
enemies on every side,
and he has reason to fear this, because Britain has been beating him up at every opportunity. France too, but mostly Britain has been really just absolutely smashing them at every opportunity because of their success. Yeah. There's a bitter jealousy between the British for the Germans' success, and Wilhelm articulates this quite often, and he's not wrong. And that's what he realizes. Well, they're gonna come and destroy us. We're pretty good at what we do. We're gonna have to go and strike them first.
The Brits and the Krauts, to use the terms.
Yes.
Limeys.
The Limeys, there we go. The Limeys and the Krauts.
We're going to be pejorative. Let's be pejorative all the way around.
The Limeys and the Krauts, they have just an
Limeys and the Huns.
They have such an odd relationship that has gone back and forth for centuries. I mean, essentially, the ruling family we've talked about, the ruling family in England, are Germans.
That's right.
I mean, obviously there's been enough intermarriage where they're not fully German anymore,
Right.
but they had to change their name, for God's sake,
right.
in this war.
And they basically became the ruling family in Germany, which was partially English.
Right. So, in a way, this is very much a family squabble because all the heads of state are related to begin with. But even the British and the Germans are very much, they just have this odd relationship. It's very much damn, I hate those bastards because I'm related to them in
It's
many
a big
ways.
brother, little brother that
Yeah.
The little brother is succeeding.
They're both very envious of each other.
Very much so. That's right, because
They're not supportive of each other's accomplishments.
It's the prodigal son.
Well, you're exactly right. That very much is that. Because Britain is the older brother who has all this stuff, and Wilhelm, the little brother, wants to have this navy like his older brother does.
Our place in the sun too.
That's right, and he's very good at it. The Germans are very efficient. They're not colonialists. Except late
Not
to
yet,
the
because this is
that's
the kind of
late
thing,
to the game for them.
Yeah,
and it's only
they
because
are by this time, but that is something they've come to late.
Yeah, and even so, they're not really. They only want the stuff that comes with it, but they're not after the prestige.
There wasn't a whole lot left for them to
that's part
colonize.
of it. Well, it was because it goes back to their mindset on this. The only reason they want colonies is because everybody else has them, and I'm shut out.
Well, it's what an empire does. It's what a modern nation state does, and they are brand new. So they have to get the trappings of a modern nation state.
It's like a Kardashian buying a Chanel purse. It's what you got to have.
Well, probably not that, but yeah.
That's pretty well put too, sir.
So one of the things
or
that
a new football player buying a $190,000 watch and wearing it during the game.
exactly
is what you got to do.
It's what you got to do. So one of the things that I forget which one of you said, but so it goes back to both. So it's a circular firing squad. And the alliance system is a suicide pact. You know what this is? What we have essentially come up with. World War I is the first playing out of MAD, mutually assured destruction.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yes.
That's exactly
That's
what
where
it
they
is.
got to. Yeah.
That's right, correct.
I mean, we call it MAD nowadays because it sounds much better to call it that, but essentially it is the nuclear Cold War system.
It's the nuclear option
that actually happened.
It's the nuclear option before there were nukes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a naval Cold War.
Yeah.
It's what they ended up calling it. But here, I don't think we're doing a good enough job exonerating your man.
Well, that's probably true. We are probably failing at that.
We've probably went down many engaging holes here that we love.
Right.
But you really wanted to get to a point of, again, there are a lot of things to dislike about Wilhelm.
That is correct.
I'm not going to exonerate his personal behavior.
Not at all.
To a large degree. But as far as blame for the war,
There's no question. And I think and it goes back to what we've been talking about, the whole circular firing squad idea, is the fact that the militaristic mindset that was not unique to Germany, but it's all of us. Rudyard Kipling says it very well. And you know the story of Kipling and his son, John.
Yeah,
who
Lieutenant
died.
John Kipling.
He dies at the Battle of Loos in 1915.
Yeah.
And he shouldn't have gotten in, but Kipling, who has friends in the government, gets him in, and he dies like immediately, like first out of there.
Yeah,
Kipling
first
never
out.
recovers from this. He lives for another 20 years. And Kipling was a big proponent of British imperial power up to this point. That one moment crystallizes for him how wrong he really was.
Yeah.
And in many respects, it's a great watershed moment to look at and say, this is exactly the awakening that happens on the world stage by the people of all these countries, not just England, not just America, not just Germany, but all of the companies. Puts down into this brief little stanza that he wrote. It's called The Common Form, and he wrote it right after this. And he says, and we've heard this before, we've watched Professor Holmes's Western Front. You might remember that from quite a few
Yes.
years back. He ends one of the episodes with this. He says, if any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. Part of that means I should not have been doing this to my son, but mostly it's saying we were wrong to think war was so great and so amazing a thing. We have discovered that war is truly hell, as Sherman would say. And that's kind of the whole tragedy here is if we had just seen war for what it really was, corporately, all of us, then World War I truly would not have happened. And that's kind of that's why Kaiser Wilhelm gets vilified for that because we cannot stand, nobody can, that we were wrong.
Yeah.
So somebody has to pay.
Somebody has to pay.
And they had the tools then to do that, to make that happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wilhelm paid for the sins of
Yes.
Ludendorff. I mean, if you want to shift a lot of blame for Germany's conduct during the war, it's not Wilhelm.
That's correct.
Again, like Nicholas, Wilhelm ended up a bathtub toy as well. He ceded almost all of his authority to Hindenburg and Ludendorff.
It was kind
Germany-
of smart on his part because he didn't understand it, and he knew he didn't
by the
understand
time
it.
you get to 1916, 1917, Germany is a military dictatorship
Right.
with Ludendorff and Hindenburg controlling all facets of German life.
Because-
what they ate, where they went, what they heard.
Because it's the only way to survive.
Yeah.
Because
they were nearly starving by the end of the war anyway.
exactly
so
right.
They had to do that.
And
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons for the unrestricted submarine warfare and all that stuff like that, and American neutrality, which was a complete myth because we were not even that, and we weren't the only ones.
Yeah. And you mentioned this too. That Wilhelm thought unrestricted warfare a bad idea.
He knew it was eventually it would lead because he understood the concept of propaganda.
Yeah.
Hindenburg and Ludendorff probably did not. They're worried about winning the war. That's why the system was supposed to work this way. He's supposed to say, no, wait a minute. The world will hate us for this.
Really, that's the way it should work.
That's right.
The experts execute the policy,
That's right.
whereas the leaders said it.
And Wilhelm ceded the policy. And so to that,
But he was pressured into it because
Yeah.
there's that little boy again.
yes.
Sometimes he's willing to draw the line and stick to it, but he's not consistent with that.
He
Well-
saw the two of them just like he saw Bismarck.
That's right. Yeah, he could. Wilhelm is far more a complex individual. You cannot simply dismiss him to say, well, he was incompetent like Nicholas.
Yeah.
He was very competent at times,
The problem is
but
going
not
to,
always.
The problem is going to be not entirely whether or not he's competent. Part of the problem is going to be how others are going to view him. And I have to think that at this time, coming from that background, that what we view of as a militaristic background, that somebody with his deformity in his arm is never going to be taken seriously, even by those that he is ruling, because he's not seen as a full man.
There's a degree
I think
of that.
that's there's going to be a lot of
think
that.
that's got a lot of that.
His advisors went around him as often as they possibly could.
And really, weren't we seeing this already in the three douchey autocratic systems? Nicholas was weak because he let Rasputin come in and influence things. He lost control. The women in his family had a lot of influence, if I remember correctly.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and then in the Austrian situation, we had something similar going on where, and I'm blanking here. What was?
Franz Joseph was the emperor,
Yes.
and his Franz Ferdinand, of course, was his heir.
Right.
But it was Karl Franz, his other nephew, that became emperor when Franz Joseph died in 1916.
Right, and part of the problem there was he was so old too.
Correct. Well,
So
he
there's
was-
going to be a little bit of he's an old guy. We don't need to listen to him. So there's going to be a little bit of that, I think, going on in all three of these places.
Yeah. But you were grasping for someone else in Austria that was...
Yeah, it seemed like there was somebody else that was seen as weak and not a worthy leader, and maybe I'm misremembering this.
Well-
because I'm totally blanking on that
Yeah.
right now.
No, I don't think there's anybody like that. But there is just that, we talked about this guy. The one guy in Austria banging the drum constantly for war with Serbia is Hotzendorf.
That's correct. I think that's who you're
And
looking for.
he's-
If you want to
He's
lay a
not
lot of
necessarily
blame,
a weak leader, but he is. I mean, I think we talked about his weird story of his wife dies, and he attaches himself to someone else's wife
That's what I'm thinking of
and
because
begins an affair with her, and it's really bizarre. And it ends up being where the woman he's with, her husband is an industrialist, and so now he knows he has the Army Chief of Staff by the short and curlies.
right, actually,
He's got all his stuff on the side, so he doesn't care about his wife. But
There's
he uses
that.
it as an entree to get contracts.
and the guy who eventually took over for Franz Joseph, he ended up none of his heirs were going to be in the succession. Maybe
Franz
that's what I'm
Ferdinand.
thinking of.
You're thinking
Because
of
again,
Ferdinand.
that's going to be problematic for those, because what's
There's
the
a
point?
vacuum after Franz Ferdinand.
Right.
That's correct, which becomes an enormously larger issue once he's assassinated. So there's all those.
So all of these things, all of these leaders that end up not surviving as leaders, well, obviously Nicholas doesn't survive. There are issues with them, I think, because of how they are viewed, and those are the easiest to vilify. So I'm willing to bet on the English side, there's going to be a little bit of this prejudice against him, not just because he's German, he's the enemy, but he's an easy target.
Well, yeah. Autocracy makes it easy to find a target to go against because you've only got one guy at the top.
Well, not even
far
that,
as you
but I mean,
know.
being this half a man thing, I think this is going to subtly play into a lot of this. So I do think he's a douchebag, because I think they were all douchebags. I think even the guys on the Allies side are a bunch of douchebags.
Yeah.
Clemenceau could be the short-sighted, myopic.
Yeah.
Lloyd George could be very myopic about all of this too.
But
I think you're on the side.
The greed is enormous here. Once it becomes a shark fest. It becomes a battle for blood.
Sharknado.
That's right. That's what we're after, because they recognized once they got into it, we have the ability to make a hell of a lot of money and get a hell of a lot of territory and put ourselves into power on the world stage forever. We are taking out a rival of ours, and they will not come back. So they think.
Yeah, so they think.
So they think.
So, I think the question, obviously, if we ask the question, we already relatively know the answer. Of course, the loser is going to be unjustly vilified in this. I mean, he does have a personal piece of responsibility because he's still the leader. I mean,
and he didn't stop it.
Now, whether or not he could have, that's something else.
Yeah, I don't believe it.
He still has to bear some responsibility. Yeah. I think it is wrong for him to get all the blame that he gets. I think that does come through. I think even in what we do learn in our history classes, although granted it's been so long since we sat in a history class, I don't know what they're teaching nowadays. If they even teach this stuff anymore. But it is definitely you could look at the South and the North in the Civil War. People argue today over who was right, who was wrong, what the war was about.
Yeah.
And who bore responsibility for this, that, and the other thing. At the time, John Brown was a domestic terrorist.
Yeah.
But once the war starts, it becomes about slavery. Well, he wasn't such a bad guy.
He was a saint.
Yeah.
In certain circles, and he was the devil in others.
Right. So a lot of this depends on which side you're on when you're looking at it. Now, 100 years later, it's a lot easier for us to come back and look at it with a little bit more of a impartial eye.
Yeah.
But
it becomes difficult to draw a line between relativism and some kind of absolute moral judgment.
Right.
Well, and
that's very good.
That's very good. That's
nice
very
one.
good.
Nice one. Liked his intro. Liked it.
And I can tell you for a fact, one of the things that really makes this so tragic, for all the other reasons of tragic, that itself, we get the whole World War II, we get the whole Hitler, we get the evil and all that sort of stuff like that. Churchill himself said in 1945 that the greatest mistake the Allies made in the Treaty of Versailles was to insist on the Kaiser's abdication, because he believes, and this is 45, this is after the war, if Kaiser had stayed in power, Hitler could never have risen. And boy, doesn't that send a chill down your bones.
I think that you could have also insisted on his abdication. I think that wasn't the biggest thing. I think the biggest thing that led to Hitler was the punitive terms as far as reparations.
Oh yes, that's correct.
That is a far bigger thing, because if you have a Weimar Republic that is not economically crippled, that alone could prevent it. Because let's face it, he came up through being dissatisfied with what was going on. Economics drives so much.
That was part of it.
Yeah, the Allies did themselves no favors in either thing. You're absolutely right.
Put them together, and it's almost inevitable.
There is a kernel, though, of where the Germans do deserve the blame.
Yes.
And that's they lied to their people about losing.
Yes, that is true.
They never really owned up to they lost. There was always this.
We were stabbed in the back.
There was that
That's part
whole
of it. That's
Jubal
right.
early lost cause transplanted to our armies were never beaten in the field. We were stabbed in the back by the home.
We were
front.
never invaded, and it was an
who's to
armistice.
blame?
It was a ceasefire, not a surrender.
Yeah, it was the Jews were to blame for stabbing us in the back.
Which is the same thing over again.
Yeah.
You have to find a scapegoat.
Yes.
You have to find somebody to blame.
Just as the winner cannot make, at first they get to write the history, but just as you cannot make peace with the devil, you cannot admit that you are the devil.
Yeah.
Oh, that is good.
Yeah.
That's very good.
Yeah.
You have to have somebody else to blame.
All right.
Because that's just human nature. I think I said it earlier.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to take responsibility.
Well, guys, we're at 45 minutes.
I wondered how far we were gone
I
because
know,
I knew we were over.
I said, well, I'm just going to let us blow right through 30 minutes because there's just so much here. It's so good. Did we answer your question?
Yes, we did.
Did we at least to a degree exonerate
The answer to the question is Kaiser Wilhelm a douchebag or unjustly vilified? And of course, the answer, which we knew from the beginning,
Yes.
is yes.
Is yes.
It is both.
Yes, it's
That
both.
is
It's
correct.
both.
And we can bemoan the fact that it is both.
Yeah.
As he said, he did himself no favors personally.
Is it Jungian? Is it the duality of man?
I think we could make that claim.
Okay.
That's very much so. That's correct.
Very nice. Very
I'm
nice.
stealing something from Full Metal Jacket. And
Hey, speaking of
not
metal,
that I've ever studied
where's the big metal
psychology.
hoopajube in all this?
So I'm going to take a nice slurp of my Elijah Craig bourbon. I got
Here.
Elijah Craig small batch here on the shelf, and it's pretty darn smooth. So I think we answered your
Nothing
question.
better than a smooth bourbon.
Yeah.
Into that.
Anyway, I think I cut you off, Francis. What else do you got to wrap
No,
us up with?
I think we've got it. We have pummeled this expired equine quite a bit.
So what's up next?
So do you want to say what's next, or
Yeah,
we
because
read this out?
the reason we should, because
Yes.
it's kind of a part two in many respects.
Exactly.
Yes, because we're going to talk about, we've talked about Wilhelm, we've talked about World War I, and talked about avoiding it and what could have happened. We're going to kind of take a step, 2-3 steps backwards, and continue this discussion in the next episode. We're going to talk about Friedrich III, Wilhelm's father, and
Now-
that 99 days. If it had been a long reign, what would the world have looked like?
Now, this is going to be Martin's episode,
Martin's
right?
gonna-
Yeah,
Martin's
Martin's
going to
gonna
narrate
narrate
this
this
one. And we're going to kind of basically try and see that if we kind of said this is what happens with Wilhelm, what do you do if you remove him and put in his place someone that's very different? We'll get into that in the next episode. Don't miss it. It's going to be real exciting.
Thanks for being with us here every week at Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Be sure to spread the word on your social media accounts. Follow us and retweet us. We are on Instagram and on Twitter at Snakes and Otters.
Let your friends know that they can find us on Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Just search Snakes and Otters Podcast to find us, and please remember to leave us your comments and reviews. It helps people find us.
And you can always send us an email at snakesandotterspodcast@gmail.com.
I'm Martin.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis. Catch us next week. Same snake time, same otter channel.